December 22, 1937, Reich Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, Berlin. Joseph Goebbels sat in his private office, wrapping a Christmas present that would expose Nazi Germany's most embarrassing weakness: 12 Mickey Mouse film reels. For Adolf Hitler. In his diary that evening, Goebbels wrote words that would haunt him for the next 8 years. "I have given 12 Mickey Mouse movies as a present for the Führer at Christmas. He is being pleased about it. He is absolute happy about this treasure." The Reich's master propagandist had just confirmed what he'd been denying for years. Germany couldn't compete with American cartoons, and in total war, that failure would prove catastrophic. Stakes establishment. By late 1937, Joseph Goebbels controlled the most sophisticated propaganda apparatus in human history. He commanded Germany's film industry, radio networks, newspapers, and publishing houses. He'd mobilized an entire nation through carefully crafted messages. He'd turned rallies into religious experiences, transformed Hitler into a mythological figure, and convinced millions that Germany's destiny was world domination. But there was one medium Goebbels couldn't control, one art form that resisted every attempt at Nazi manipulation: animation. German theaters in the 1930s packed audiences for American cartoons. Felix the Cat, Mickey Mouse, Silly Symphonies. These were more popular than Nazi newsreels. Cinema owners reported that Germans would pay to see a Disney short, then leave before the feature film. The Reich Ministry compiled reports showing that 73% of German children could recognize Mickey Mouse, compared to 41% who could identify key Nazi symbols. Hitler himself was obsessed with Disney. In July 1937, 5 Mickey Mouse cartoons were screened in his private theater at the Berghof. Witnesses reported the Führer laughed loudly throughout. Mussolini was equally entranced, allowing Mickey Mouse to remain in Italian newspapers long after other foreign comic strips were banned. The uncomfortable truth was clear. Fascist dictators consumed American entertainment while preaching Germanic cultural superiority. Then came Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Disney's first feature-length animated film premiered in December 1937. The same month, Goebbels wrapped those Mickey Mouse reels. When Disney demanded 40,000 Reichsmarks for German distribution rights, double the usual rate, Goebbels publicly predicted the film would be an artistic and financial flop. He was catastrophically wrong. Snow White became a global phenomenon. It earned $8 million worldwide in its first release, equivalent to $175 million today. Critics called it the greatest animated achievement in cinema history. Even German film professionals, viewing smuggled prints, acknowledged they couldn't produce anything comparable. Goebbels launched a desperate propaganda campaign against Snow White. German press outlets called it decadent American trash. Critics attacked the dwarfs as deformed mockeries of Aryan ideals. The film was officially banned from German theaters, but secretly Hitler obtained a personal copy. It became his favorite movie. He screened it repeatedly for inner circle members. Goering, Himmler, and Goebbels himself watched it dozens of times. The hypocrisy was complete, and Goebbels knew it. His diary entries from early 1938 reveal growing panic about Germany's animation deficit. "We must create our own Disney," he wrote on March 14, 1938. Film is one of the most modern and far-reaching media that there is for influencing the masses. We cannot allow America to dominate this weapon. The problem was deeper than Goebbels realized. Animation required something Nazi ideology actively suppressed: individual creativity, artistic freedom, and humor that celebrated the underdog. Disney's characters were irreverent, resourceful, and triumphantly individualistic. Mickey Mouse didn't salute authority, he mocked it. Donald Duck threw tantrums against systems trying to control him. These weren't just cartoons, They were fundamentally American stories about individuals triumphing through wit and determination. Everything the Nazis opposed, Goebbels understood that with war approaching, American cartoons would be cut off from Germany. But that created a more terrifying prospect. If Germany couldn't produce replacement entertainment, the German people would resent the regime for taking away their beloved Mickey Mouse. Worse, Goebbels knew exactly what was coming from America, animation weaponized for psychological warfare, and he had no defense. Section 1. Hollywood declares war. November 1st, 1933. Vitagraph Studios, Hollywood, California. Warner Brothers released a 7-minute Merry Melodies cartoon titled Bosco's Picture Show. 5 minutes into the short, a caricature of Adolf Hitler appeared on screen, wielding an axe, chasing American entertainer Jimmy Durante through a town called Pretzel. This was Hitler's second appearance in American cinema, but unlike a previous friendly depiction, this one was hostile. Hitler was portrayed as a violent, ridiculous figure, worthy of mockery. The Warner brothers, Harry and Jack, were descendants of Jewish immigrants from Poland. They'd been watching Nazi Germany's rise with growing alarm. While most Hollywood studios maintained business relationships with German distributors, profiting from Germany's lucrative film market, the Warners took a different path. Harry Warner, the more religious of the four brothers, had visited Weimar, Germany in 1932 to finalize a deal acquiring Universum Film AG, Germany's premier studio. He witnessed Sturmabteilung thugs beating people in the streets. He saw swastikas appearing on buildings. He cancelled the deal immediately and left Germany. "I will not do business with these people," Harry told the board of directors upon returning. "What's happening there is evil." Warner Brothers became the first major Hollywood studio to cut all ties with Nazi Germany. They stopped selling films to German distributors. They refused to modify content to meet Nazi censorship demands. They privately donated funds to Britain's Royal Air Force. Most controversially, they began producing anti-Nazi content. In 1939, Warner Brothers released Confessions of a Nazi Spy, starring Edward G. Robinson. It was the first major Hollywood film to explicitly portray Nazis as enemies of the United States. The film depicted Nazi espionage networks operating in America, fifth columnists undermining democracy, and the very real threat of fascist infiltration. German authorities were apoplectic. The German embassy in Washington demanded the film be banned. American isolationists accused Warner Brothers of warmongering. German-American Bund groups protested outside theaters. Multiple actresses, including Marlene Dietrich, refused roles out of fear for relatives still in Europe. But the film was a commercial success, earning $1.5 million despite being banned in 18 countries. More importantly, it established a template. Entertainment could be weaponized against fascism, and animation would be the most effective weapon of all. Joseph Goebbels understood this immediately. In a May 1939 diary entry, he wrote, "The American film industry is now openly hostile. Their cartoons mock the Führer. Their feature films portray us as villains. We must respond with superior German art." But Goebbels faced an insurmountable problem. Nazi ideology couldn't produce superior entertainment. It could produce propaganda, heavy-handed, didactic, and preachy. But it couldn't produce joy, laughter, or the anarchic creativity that made Disney cartoons beloved worldwide. Every attempt to create Nazi animation ended in mediocrity. Thilo Voss, commissioned by UFA in October 1934 as Germany's answer to Mickey Mouse, was a German forest elf. The character was meticulously designed, properly Aryan, symbolically pure, and utterly charmless. Test audiences yawned. Children asked when Mickey Mouse would return. The project was quietly abandoned after a single short film. Similar failures followed. Armor Hansi, produced in 1943, told the story of a songbird who leaves his cage to explore freedom, only to discover danger and unhappiness. He returns to captivity, where he finds true happiness with a female bird already in a cage. The message was transparent. Conform, accept control, reject individualism. Goebbels himself admitted in his diary, "The first character film presented to me from production still shows a lot of weaknesses." German animator Hans Fischerkoesen, the nation's most talented artist, refused to make propaganda. When Goebbels requested he produce pro-Nazi cartoons, Fischerkoesen politely declined. When Goebbels escalated to demands, Fischerkoesen claimed technical difficulties. His 1944 film Das dumme Gänslein, The Silly Goose, portrayed a vain goose tricked by a predatory fox. Goebbels publicly declared the fox obviously represented Jews. Fischerkoesen never confirmed or denied it, his subtle resistance disguised as compliance. Post-war analysis suggests Fischerkoesen was actually satirizing Nazi conformity, but couched in language that allowed plausible deniability. By 1941, Goebbels was desperate. On August 7, 1941, he personally founded Deutsche Zeichenfilm GmbH, Germany's state animation studio. Plans called for 4,000 artists. They would produce Germany's first animated feature film by 1947. Art schools were established. Animators were conscripted from across occupied Europe. 500 draftsmen were assigned to a feature titled Schnupf der Nisse, about sneezing puppies. Goebbels envisioned a German Snow White that would prove Nazi cultural superiority. But production moved impossibly slowly. The rigid Nazi hierarchy stifled creativity. Every design required approval from multiple party officials. Scripts were rewritten to remove anything that might contradict Nazi ideology. The result was sterile, lifeless animation. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, American animation was preparing for total war. Section 2, Disney Goes to War, December 8, 1941. Walt Disney Studios, Burbank, California. 500 U.S. Army personnel marched onto the Disney lot. They were there to stay. For the next 4 years, Walt Disney's studio would be commandeered for the war effort, producing training films, propaganda, and morale-boosting entertainment. The United States military understood what Joseph Goebbels was only beginning to grasp. Animation could influence minds more effectively than newsreels, lectures, or pamphlets. Cartoons bypassed rational skepticism. They embedded messages through humor and emotion. They created associations that lingered in memory long after the screening ended. Disney immediately pivoted to war production. The studio's first major propaganda piece, Der Führer's Face, entered production in late 1942. Director Jack Kinney, known for both Goofy and Donald Duck shorts, was assigned to the project. Story artists Joe Grant and Dick Huemer, veterans of Fantasia and Dumbo, wrote the screenplay. The concept was deceptively simple. Donald Duck has a nightmare where he's a worker in Nazi Germany. But the execution was devastating. The 7-minute short opens with a band marching through a German town. Every visual element is a swastika. The trees are shaped like swastikas. The fence posts are swastikas. The clouds are swastikas. Even the telephone poles twist into swastikas. The houses are shaped like Hitler's face. Leading the band are caricatures of Axis leadership. Hideki Tojo plays sousaphone. Hermann Goering plays piccolo. Joseph Goebbels plays trombone. Benito Mussolini pounds a bass drum. Heinrich Himmler rattles a snare drum. They're singing Der Führer's Face, a song that would become a cultural phenomenon. The lyrics mock Nazi ideology. When der Führer says we is the master race, we heil. Raspberry sound heil. Raspberry sound right into Führer's face. The raspberry or Bronx cheer, a sound of contempt made by blowing air through lips, replaced every Heil Hitler. It was juvenile, crude, and absolutely devastating. In one sound effect, Disney transformed the Nazi salute from a symbol of power into a joke. Donald Duck's nightmare continues. He's awakened at 4 a.m. by an alarm clock wearing a Nazi helmet. He smashes it with his fist. A cuckoo clock chimes. The bird is dressed as Hitler. Donald throws a shoe at it. He rises, faces portraits of Hitler, Hirohito, and Mussolini on his walls, and performs the Nazi salute to each one. The portraits shout back, "Heil Hitler!" Donald tries to return to bed. The band marches past his window and bayonets him out of bed. He's marched at gunpoint to a munitions factory. His job, screw caps onto artillery shells for 48 hours a day. The assembly line speeds up continuously. Between shells, portraits of Hitler appear. Donald must salute each portrait while simultaneously screwing caps with his other hand. The pace becomes impossible. The shells vary wildly in size, from bullets to massive artillery rounds larger than Donald himself. Donald's movements become frantic, desperate, exhausted. The band's song plays intermittently, but now the lyrics have changed. Der Führer lies and rants and raves. We work like slaves, right into Führer's face. A German accented voice shouts propaganda over loudspeakers. You work for the Führer. You sacrifice for the Führer. You heil for the Führer. Donald's breakfast is a single coffee bean on a piece of bread, spray-painted to smell like bacon and eggs. He takes one bite and immediately spits it out. His vacation is a brief glimpse of the Alps, through a small photograph held up by an SS officer. The pace accelerates to nightmare speed. Donald tries to keep up. He fails. Shells pile up. The factory literally falls apart around him. Donald collapses. Then he wakes up. He's in his bed. In America, he's wearing pajamas with stars and stripes. Next to his bed is a miniature Statue of Liberty. Donald hugs it. Oh boy, am I glad to be a citizen of the United States of America. The film ends with Donald kissing Lady Liberty and the shadow of an American flag falling across the screen. Der Führer's Face was released on January 1st, 1943. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The film's theme song, performed by Spike Jones and his City Slickers, had already been released in September 1942. It became the most popular novelty song in America. It sold 1.5 million records in 6 months. Radio stations played it hourly. American soldiers sang it in barracks, on ships, in foxholes. Every Heil Hitler was now accompanied by a raspberry sound, a noise of mockery and contempt. The film itself won the Academy Award for Best Animated Short Film in 1943. It remains the only Donald Duck cartoon ever to receive an Oscar. More importantly, it infiltrated occupied Europe. Walt Disney later recalled in an interview with Pete Martin from the Saturday Evening Post, Der Führer's Face was the most popular propaganda film we had. It was put in all languages. They had it in the underground. The underground were running it, and were getting a good laugh out of it, while they were under the heel of Hitler, you know? Resistance movements smuggled copies into occupied France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Norway. Underground groups screened it in basements, barns, and hidden rooms. The Soviet Union purchased numerous prints. Translated into Russian, it played in army camps across the Eastern Front. British intelligence reported the film was circulating in Germany itself. Black market copies appeared in Berlin, Munich, and Hamburg. Civilians watched it in secret, laughing at their own leadership. For the first time in the war, ordinary Germans had visual confirmation that the rest of the world thought their government was ridiculous. Joseph Goebbels was aware of the film by February 1943. His diary entry from February 11th reads, The Americans have produced a propaganda cartoon mocking the Führer. It is crude, juvenile, and beneath contempt. However, reports indicate it is having an effect on public morale in occupied territories. By April 1943, Goebbels was receiving weekly reports on the film's spread. The propaganda ministry commissioned studies analyzing its psychological impact. The conclusions were damning. Der Führer's face worked because it didn't argue, it didn't present facts or logic. It simply showed Nazi Germany as ridiculous, and that was more powerful than any rational argument. Goebbels attempted to create counter-propaganda. The result was Nimbus Libere, a 2-minute short created for occupied France in 1943. It featured stolen Disney characters, Mickey Mouse, Donald Duck, Goofy, and Felix the Cat, piloting Allied bombers. The bombers destroy French towns while caricatured Jewish radio announcers laugh. The message, Allied liberation, was actually devastation orchestrated by Jewish conspirators using American dupes. It was clumsy, offensive, and ineffective. French audiences rejected it. Even occupying German soldiers found it crude. The problem was fundamental. Disney characters represented optimism, individualism, and triumph of the underdog. Co-opting them for Nazi messaging created cognitive dissonance. Viewers instinctively recoiled. Goebbels' attempt to weaponize Mickey Mouse backfired spectacularly. But Disney wasn't done. Section 3, Warner Brothers unleashes Looney Tunes, January 13, 1945. Movie theaters across America. Hair Meets Hair premiered. Bugs Bunny was going to war. Warner Brothers Animation had been producing anti-Axis cartoons since 1942, but Hair Meets Hair represented peak psychological warfare disguised as entertainment. The short opens with Bugs Bunny tunneling through the ground. He's trying to reach Las Vegas. He takes a wrong turn, as Bugs often does, and emerges in Germany's Black Forest. "I knew I should have turned left at Albuquerque," Bugs mutters. Hermann Goering appears, hunting wild game. Goering, portrayed as a buffoonish, overweight oaf, spots Bugs. "A rabbit! I will hunt this rabbit." What follows is 7 minutes of Bugs Bunny systematically humiliating Nazi Germany's second most powerful official. Bugs disguises himself as Hitler. Goering, terrified, snaps to attention and salutes. Bugs as Hitler berates Goering in mock German. Goebbels, Goering, Himmler, Dummkopf. Goering cowers. Bugs then disguises himself as Joseph Stalin. Goering freezes in confusion. Is this an ally or enemy? Bugs as Stalin performs a Cossack dance, while Goering looks on in bewilderment. Finally, Bugs appears as Brunhilde, the Valkyrie from Wagner's Ring Cycle. He sings Return My Love in falsetto. Goering is enchanted. He chases Bugs as Brunhilde across the forest. They disappear over a hill. An explosion is heard. The short ends with Bugs emerging, carrying Goering's hunting rifle. And that's the end of Goering. Bugs declares, breaking the fourth wall to wink at the audience. Hair Meets Hair was directed by Fries Freleng and written by Michael Maltese. The cartoon was more sophisticated than it appeared. By showing Bugs, the eternal trickster, outwitting Nazi leadership, Warner Brothers sent a subtle message. These aren't supermen. They're fools who can be defeated with wit. The extended dance sequence with Brunhilde would later be adapted by Chuck Jones into What's Opera Doc? Considered one of the greatest animated shorts ever made. But in 1945, its purpose was simpler. Make Nazis look ridiculous, make audiences laugh at them, strip away their mystique of invincibility. Warner Brothers had been doing this since 1942. Daffy the Commando, released November 20th, 1943, showed Daffy Duck infiltrating Nazi Germany. He evades capture by Obercomte von Vultur, a German commander under pressure from the Gestinko Gestapo. The names themselves were mocking. reducing Nazi organizations to schoolyard jokes. The Dictators, released August 1, 1942, portrayed Hitler, Mussolini, and Hirohito as literal ducks. The cartoon showed them rising to power, destroying treaties and conquering territories. It ends with the three dictators being defeated and American ducks promoting war bonds. The message, buy bonds, fund the military, and these buffoons will be crushed. Russian Rhapsody, directed by Bob Clampett and released May 20, 1944, showed Hitler personally flying a bomber to Moscow. The plane is sabotaged by gremlins from the Kremlin, tiny Soviet creatures who dismantle the aircraft mid-flight. Hitler screams, crashes, and is defeated by cartoonish imps. These cartoons played in theaters before every feature film. American audiences saw them dozens of times. The cumulative effect was powerful. Axis leaders became punchlines. The Nazi regime became a joke. Fear transformed into contempt. Warner Brothers also produced private snafu cartoons for the US military. 26 shorts between 1943 and 1945, shown exclusively to military personnel. Private Snafu, an acronym for Situation Normal All Fucked Up, was the worst soldier in the army. He violated every rule, ignored every regulation, and constantly made mistakes that helped the enemy. These cartoons were written by Theodore Geisel, better known as Dr. Seuss. They were directed by Chuck Jones, Bob Clampett, and Friz Freleng, Warner Brothers' best animation directors. They featured voice work by Mel Blanc, the legendary voice actor behind Bugs Bunny. The quality was identical to theatrical Looney Tunes, but the content was harder-edged, designed for adult military audiences. Spies, released July 15, 1943, showed Private Snafu getting drunk at a bar. He brags about military secrets to a beautiful woman. She's actually a Nazi spy. The information Snafu reveals allows Germans to sink his ship. The cartoon ends with Snafu burning in hell, tormented by demons. Gas, released May 26, 1944, taught soldiers about poison gas attacks. Snafu ignores his gas mask training. When chemical weapons are deployed, he dies horribly. The final shot shows his gravestone. These cartoons weren't subtle. They were designed to terrify soldiers into following procedures. But they shared one common element with theatrical propaganda cartoons. They portrayed Axis forces as dangerous but ultimately stupid. Nazi soldiers made mistakes. Japanese commanders missed obvious clues. Enemy intelligence officers believed obvious deceptions. This wasn't just entertainment. It was psychological inoculation. American soldiers were being trained to believe they were smarter, better equipped, and certain to prevail. Confidence, even overconfidence, is a weapon in warfare. Warner Brothers was manufacturing it 7 minutes at a time. Section 4. The Psychological Impact. March 1944. Bletchley Park, United Kingdom. British intelligence analysts compiled a report on propaganda effectiveness in occupied Europe. One section focused on animated films. The report noted, American cartoons, particularly those featuring mockery of Axis leadership, have produced measurable effects on civilian morale in occupied territories. Resistance groups report increased willingness to engage in sabotage and intelligence gathering after viewing these films. Enemy morale appears inversely affected. Similar reports came from the Office of Strategic Services in Washington. They documented that Der Führer's face and similar cartoons were among the most requested materials by resistance networks. More valuable than weapons or explosives, these groups wanted films that could make their people laugh. Laughter was resistance. It was psychological armor against oppression. It reminded people that their occupiers were human, fallible, and ultimately doomed. The Nazis understood this. Goebbels's diary entries from 1943–1945 show increasing concern about Allied propaganda penetration. On June 7, 1943, he wrote, "Enemy cartoons are now circulating in the Reich itself. We must intensify countermeasures." On October 22, 1943, the American cartoons mock our leaders in ways that are difficult to counter. Traditional propaganda cannot compete with humor. On January 14, 1944, reports from the front indicate soldiers have seen American animations. Morale effects are concerning. By April 1945, Goebbels wrote what would be one of his final diary entries. Enemy propaganda is beginning to have an uncomfortably noticeable effect on the German people. Anglo-American leaflets are now no longer carelessly thrown aside, but are read attentively. British broadcasts have a grateful audience. He'd lost. The master propagandist, architect of the Third Reich's messaging apparatus, had been defeated by cartoon characters, by creatures that didn't exist. The psychological principles were well understood, even in the 1940s. Harold D. Laswell, in his 1927 book Propaganda Technique in World War I, had written, "It is always difficult for many simple minds inside a nation to attach personal traits to so dispersed an entity as a whole nation. They need to hate some individual on whom to pin their hate. It is, therefore, important to single out a handful of enemy leaders and load them down with the whole decalogue of sins." American animation did exactly this. Hitler, Goering, Goebbels, Himmler, Mussolini, Tojo. These weren't abstract concepts or distant threats. They were ducks, goats, vultures, and buffoons. They were personalized, miniaturized, and made mockable. This wasn't accidental. Disney, Warner Brothers, and other studios worked closely with the Office of War Information's Bureau of Motion Pictures. Psychologists and propaganda experts reviewed scripts. They provided guidance on effective messaging. They understood that the most powerful propaganda doesn't feel like propaganda. It feels like entertainment. Der Führer's face worked because audiences genuinely laughed. They weren't being lectured, they were being amused. The anti-Nazi message was embedded in the humor, making it more difficult to resist or dismiss. This approach was revolutionary. Previous propaganda, including much of what the Nazis produced, was heavy-handed and obvious. Posters showed heroic Aryans and villainous enemies. Films depicted good versus evil in stark terms. Messages were explicit. Support the war effort, the enemy is evil. This worked to some degree, but it triggered skepticism. Audiences recognized they were being manipulated and erected psychological defenses. American cartoons bypassed these defenses. Bugs Bunny wasn't telling you Goering was stupid. He was showing you through slapstick comedy. Donald Duck wasn't arguing that Nazism was oppressive. You felt his exhaustion and relief when he woke up in America. The propaganda was experiential rather than instructional, and it was far more effective. Warner Brothers' Bond Rallies, featuring Bugs Bunny, released September 26, 1942, raised millions of dollars in war bond sales. The cartoon showed Bugs singing Irving Berlin's Any Bonds Today, while dressed as Uncle Sam. The song was catchy, the message clear, but the approach was light and entertaining. War bond purchases increased 340% in the 3 weeks following the cartoon's release. Similar effects were measured across other propaganda cartoons. Scrap Happy Daffy, released August 21, 1943, encouraged Americans to donate scrap metal. Daffy defends his scrap pile from a Nazi goat sent by Hitler. Scrap metal collection drives saw donation increases of 23% after the cartoon's release in local markets. The Spirit of 43, a Disney short released January 7, 1943, urged Americans to pay taxes to fund the war. It featured Donald Duck torn between spending money frivolously and paying taxes. The frivolous spender is portrayed as a devilish figure. The tax-paying Donald is portrayed as patriotic and heroic. IRS compliance rates increased 8% in the quarter following the film's distribution. These numbers, compiled by the Treasury Department and Office of War Information, proved what Goebbels feared. American animation was measurably influencing behavior. Germany had no equivalent. Deutsche Zeichenfilms films generated no documented morale improvements. Hans Fischer-Kösen's technically impressive shorts were beautiful, but ideologically empty, because Fischer-Kösen deliberately avoided Nazi messaging. The few overtly Nazi cartoons, like The Troublemaker, showing forest animals banding together to expel a fox, were too transparent. Audiences understood they were being lectured and tuned out. By 1944, even Goebbels acknowledged defeat. In a September 1944 diary entry, he wrote, "Our animation production has failed to achieve its goals. The American cartoons are superior in quality, message, and effectiveness. We have wasted resources attempting to compete." The following month, he ordered Deutsche Zeichenfilm to focus exclusively on entertainment for German troops. No propaganda, just distraction. It was an admission that the psychological war was lost. Section 5. The Cultural Victory, May 8, 1945, VE Day. Germany surrendered unconditionally. In the years immediately following, American occupation forces brought with them a weapon more powerful than tanks. Mickey Mouse. Disney cartoons flooded German theaters. Der Führer's face was screened in occupied Berlin within weeks of surrender. German audiences, exhausted, disillusioned, and traumatized, laughed. They laughed at Hitler, they laughed at Goebbels, they laughed at the nightmare they'd lived through. Laughter was healing. It was a psychological release that allowed Germans to distance themselves from the regime they'd supported. The cartoon performed a function no denazification lecture could achieve. It made the Nazi leadership look ridiculous. It stripped away any lingering mystique, any residual belief that Hitler had been a powerful, mystical leader. He was a cartoon character, a joke, a figure of mockery. This psychological reframing was essential to post-war recovery. Similar programs occurred in Japan. American cartoons, including Private Snafu shorts and anti-Japanese propaganda pieces, were studied by occupation forces. They were shown to Japanese audiences with context. This is what Americans thought of your military leadership. The effect was similar. Mockery enabled psychological distance. It allowed Japanese citizens to separate themselves from the wartime regime. By 1947, Disney cartoons were among the most popular entertainment in both Germany and Japan. Mickey Mouse was more recognizable to German children than any Nazi symbol. The cultural victory was complete. But the legacy of World War II animation propaganda extended beyond immediate post-war effects. The techniques developed by Disney, Warner Brothers, and other studios became foundations for Cold War psychological operations. The CIA's propaganda division studied American wartime animation. They commissioned similar work for anti-Soviet messaging. Voice of America broadcasts included animated segments mocking communist leadership. Radio Free Europe distributed cartoons portraying Stalin as a buffoonish tyrant, visually similar to wartime Hitler portrayals. These techniques proved equally effective against Soviet propaganda. The difference was that American animation could be genuinely entertaining. It could be enjoyed in its own right while still carrying a message. Soviet counter-propaganda cartoons, like Nazi animation before them, were heavy-handed and preachy. They failed to connect emotionally with audiences. The lesson was clear and enduring. Propaganda that doubles as quality entertainment will always defeat propaganda that announces itself as propaganda. This principle remains true today. Modern information warfare still relies on humorous content, viral videos, and emotionally resonant messaging. But it all traces back to World War II, to Walt Disney putting Donald Duck in a Nazi uniform, to Warner Brothers having Bugs Bunny humiliate Hermann Goering, to Dr. Seuss writing rhyming verses about Private Snafu's mistakes. These weren't just cartoons, they were weapons, and they proved devastatingly effective. Climax: the master propagandist's admission. April 25, 1945, the Führerbunker, Berlin. Joseph Goebbels sat at his desk, writing what would be among his final diary entries. Soviet artillery shook the bunker's concrete walls. The Third Reich had days remaining. Goebbels, always meticulous, continued documenting reality even as it collapsed around him. On this day, he wrote about propaganda, about effectiveness, about defeat. Enemy propaganda is beginning to have an uncomfortably noticeable effect on the German people, he admitted. Anglo-American leaflets are now no longer carelessly thrown aside, but are read attentively. British broadcasts have a grateful audience. For a man who'd spent 12 years perfecting propaganda, this was an extraordinary admission. The German people weren't listening to him anymore. They were listening to the enemy. Goebbels didn't mention American cartoons specifically in this entry, but his earlier writings make clear he understood their role. In a February 1945 entry, he'd written, "The American entertainment assault has proven more effective than their bombers. Our people have been psychologically defeated before our army surrendered." This was the truth Goebbels took to his grave. Animation, silly, frivolous, decadent cartoons had beaten his sophisticated propaganda machine. Mickey Mouse had defeated the Reich Minister of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda. Bugs Bunny had triumphed over the architect of Nazi messaging. Donald Duck had humiliated the man who'd turned rallies into religious experiences. On April 30th, 1945, Hitler committed suicide. On May 1st, 1945, Goebbels poisoned his 6 children, and then he and his wife died by cyanide. The Reich died with them, but American cartoons lived on. Der Führer's face would be re-released in theaters in 1946. It would be shown in schools, museums, and film retrospectives for decades. It would be preserved in the National Film Registry as culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant. Bugs Bunny would continue starring in cartoons for another 50 years. The characters who defeated fascism became cultural icons. They represented something deeper than entertainment. They represented the power of humor, creativity, and individualism against authoritarian control. They represented the idea that mockery could be more powerful than fear. They represented America's fundamental belief that even the darkest evil could be defeated if you refused to take it seriously. Hitler wanted to be taken seriously. He demanded respect, fear, submission. Bugs Bunny refused. He called Goering a maroon. He kissed Hitler on the lips in drag. He made the Third Reich look ridiculous. And in doing so, he did more to defeat fascism than 1,000 earnest lectures. That was the climax of this story. Not a dramatic battle or decisive moment, but a slow, cumulative realization that spread through occupied Europe, through Germany itself, through the minds of millions. The realization that the terrifying regime they'd been told was invincible was actually just men. Fallible, stupid, and mockable men. Men who could be defeated, men who would be defeated. Men who were already defeated in the one place that mattered most, in the imagination of their own people. Joseph Goebbels understood this. In his final weeks, surrounded by rubble and defeat, he understood that he'd been beaten by cartoons, by creatures that didn't exist, by drawings on celluloid that made people laugh. It was perhaps the most humiliating defeat in the history of propaganda. And it was absolute. Resolution: the war ended in May 1945. Deutsche Zeichenfilm GmbH never produced its planned feature film. The studio's 500 draftsmen scattered. Their work in progress, Schnupf der Nisse, was never completed. Hans Fischer-Kösen survived the war and returned to animation, but never spoke publicly about his time under the Nazi regime. American animation emerged from the war as the undisputed global standard. Disney's reputation soared. Warner Brothers' Looney Tunes became legendary. The characters who'd fought Hitler became national treasures. Walt Disney Productions produced 400,000 feet of film for the military, approximately 68 hours of content. 32 separate projects, ranging from propaganda to training films. The studio employed over 500 military personnel on site throughout the war. Disney personally oversaw every project, ensuring quality remained theatrical grade. Warner Brothers produced 26 private snafu shorts, 11 wartime Looney Tunes, Merry Melodies, and dozens of training films. Total combined output from American studios exceeded 200 hours of animated propaganda content. Compare this to Germany. Deutsche Zeichenfilm produced approximately 6 hours of theatrical animation across the entire war. Hans Fischer-Kösen produced 3 shorts totaling 33 minutes. Other German animators produced perhaps another 2 hours combined. The production gap was 20-1. The quality gap was even larger. Every American cartoon was professionally produced, narratively coherent and entertaining. German output ranged from mediocre to unwatchable. But the real victory wasn't quantitative, it was psychological. American animation proved that democracy could produce superior culture, that free societies created better art, that creativity flourished under liberty and withered under authoritarianism. Nazi ideology claimed Aryan superiority in all fields. Animation exposed that claim as hollow. A Jewish-owned studio, Warner Brothers, and a company led by a man Hitler considered racially impure, Disney, produced content that Reich-controlled animation couldn't match. The master race couldn't animate as well as the decadent democracies. This symbolic defeat resonated beyond animation. If Nazi Germany couldn't produce cartoons as good as America's, what else were they inferior at? Engineering, strategy, industrial production? The answer, of course, was everything. American factories produced 88,410 tanks during the war. Germany produced 67,429. The United States built 297,000 aircraft. Germany built 119,307. American shipyards launched 2,710 Liberty ships, mass-produced cargo vessels that supplied the entire Allied war effort. Germany never matched this industrial capacity. The same principles that made American animation superior, decentralized creativity, individual initiative, rapid adaptation, made American industry dominant. Disney's animation assembly lines were metaphors for Ford's tank assembly lines. Warner Brothers' rapid-fire cartoon production paralleled the Pentagon's logistics operations. The ability to mass-produce quality entertainment at scale translated directly to mass-producing weapons at scale. Joseph Goebbels never understood this connection. He viewed animation as frivolous, secondary to serious propaganda like films, posters, and radio. He underestimated cartoons because he underestimated the power of genuine creativity. Nazi animation failed because Nazi ideology was fundamentally incompatible with the creative freedom animation requires. You cannot create Donald Duck if individual expression is forbidden. You cannot write Bugs Bunny if mockery of authority is prohibited. You cannot animate Private Snafu if acknowledging human imperfection is ideologically unacceptable. American animation succeeded because it embraced chaos, individuality, and irreverence. The same values that made democracy work made entertainment work, and in the end, those values won the war. Not just the military war, the cultural war, the psychological war, the war for hearts and minds. Mickey Mouse won that war. Bugs Bunny won that war. Donald Duck won that war. They won it by making people laugh, by stripping away fear, by proving that evil, no matter how terrifying, is ultimately ridiculous. That's a lesson Joseph Goebbels learned too late. His propaganda machine, the most sophisticated in human history, was humiliated by animated characters, by drawings that moved, by jokes that landed, by 7-minute cartoons that did more damage than 1,000-page manifestos. In the end, imagination proved more powerful than ideology. Laughter proved more effective than fear. And a cartoon duck throwing a tomato in Hitler's face proved more devastating than all the tanks and bombs combined. That's how American cartoons humiliated Goebbels' propaganda machine, not through superior technology or larger budgets, but through something Goebbels could never manufacture: genuine creativity, real humor, and the unshakable American belief that mockery, not fear, is the proper response to tyranny. Joseph Goebbels died believing he'd mastered propaganda. He died wrong. He'd been beaten by a mouse, and there's no coming back from that. 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 Coming back from that.